Anyways, so today we're going to be talking about how to use SQLite, which we've been talking about for the past few lectures, with Python. And as you know, we, at least advanced people, have used Flask before. So if you want to use this with Flask, you can, because Flask runs with Python. If you want to use it with some other random Python framework that's not Django, because Django has its own database management thing built in, you can do that too. If you're wondering, I'm using PyCharm, which is a Python IDE, because I feel like it. And if you don't have it, that's fine. You don't have to have it. You can just use a text editor and run it in the terminal. So the first thing we need to do is just actually import SQLite 3. SQLite 3 by default comes with Python if you have it installed, which I hope you do because we've used it a lot recently. You don't have to like pip SQLite or anything, it just is already there. The first thing we have to do is connect to our actual database file. So in this case, we're just going to use SQLite 3's connect function, and the input is just the name of your file. So I'm calling it test.db. You can call it whatever you want to, it doesn't matter. And we need to set up a variable called con, which we're going to use to represent our connection to our database. From there, we're going to need to use the cursor function to actually execute actions on our database. So the connect function establishes a connection, which is just you can consider a highway between your program, a highway of information between your program and the SQL file, and the cursor is what you actually use to do stuff. So C is what we're going to be, the C variable is what we're going to be interacting with. Throughout this, instead of putting the SQL commands within well, you'll see this later, but instead of just executing the functions with the SQL commands, I'm actually going to create separate variables that store them because I think it's just easier, and it makes it a little bit cleaner. So first we're going to create a SQL command to create the table that we're actually going to use for our users. So the triple thingy in Python, if you don't remember, is a multi-line string, and it's a really long SQL thing, so we're going to split it up over multiple lines. So we want to create a students table if one does not already exist. Obviously, if one already exists, then we don't want to override it, because that means every time we restarted our program, all our data would be lost, which is going to happen anyways here, because we're not actually changing the same database file, but I'll explain that later. Essentially, we just need this to make sure that we don't create a new students table every time. So we want an ID that's an integer and our primary key. Remember from last week, integer is the data type and primary key means that it's our identifier. We're going to want a name and a county that the student is in. And remember, you need to put this semicolon here at the end so it knows to finish the SQL command. And PyCharm is going to yell at me because I don't have a SQL database connected, but it doesn't matter. We don't need one because we're not actually using the IDE's feature. So all we're doing here is creating a new students table with 3 different fields. Is someone saying something? It's not. Oh, okay, never mind. Then we're just going to do the same, except with an events table. And remember from last time, we're just doing a really simple example where we have a table of users and a table of events. Let me make this bigger. How can I? Does anyone know how to make the text bigger in PyCharm? I have never had to do that out here.
You go to editor.
Huh?
On the left, you see editor. No, in settings.
Oh. Editor.
A font.
Ah, okay, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
I'm sorry. Okay, I hope that's better. Yeah. I may be okay at web development, but I'm not good at finding IDE settings. Anyways. We're also just going to create a table with the exact same syntax for our events, with an ID that's an integer, a name, and remember, not null means that we're not going to let it be empty. Text is the data type. And we're going to define the host ID, which is referring to the identifier for our user that is hosting the event. And it's going to reference the students table ID field. So all of this, I think, was what we did last week. So they should be familiar. If you have any questions, just let us know. To actually execute these SQL commands, we're going to use the execute function on the cursor variable that we created earlier. So it literally just takes the string of the SQL command you want to run. And now, to make it easier, instead of just making the SQL commands as we need them later on, let's make some simple functions for creating users and events. So, def create user. We're going to create a string that holds our SQL command for creating a user. And to create a user, what we're really doing is inserting a new row into the table, right? Creating a new row of data. So we're going to want to insert into students, our students table. And remember, we have to provide the order in which our variables are being used. So we're just going to provide the name and county. By default, the ID is just going to start at 1 and go up by 1 each time, so we don't need to specify that. And if you don't know, the F means that it's an F string in Python. That means that we can use these bracket things with variable names inside, and it'll replace the variable names with the actual values that they take on. So what values do we want to insert? We want to insert the name and the county. So you can see here that we have to put the name and county in single quotes because by default it's not going to do that when the Python F string replaces the variable names. So for instance, if our name was Alex and our county was FCPS, then the entire thing would look like this. And this is just a standard SQL statement. We're inserting into students the values this and this, but instead of our name, we want to replace it with the name that the function is provided, and instead of the county, we want to same thing. You might notice here that whenever we replace things into here, like what if for whatever reason they put in another single quote in their name and then put some SQL command so that it gets escaped out of this single quotes and instead executes a SQL command. That's called a SQL injection. That is beyond the scope of this lesson because it's already as long as it is. But if you're interested in learning more about SQL injections, we might either lecture on it or we'll have a guest lecture, or I think Computer Security Club covers it at some point, although that may be at the same block as this, so I can't really endorse that. But yeah, that's just something to be aware of, that you have to cleanse your inputs so that people can't execute SQL code that you don't want executed. And then easy enough, we're just going to execute our create user string here. Now also it's it's really bad practice to have variables that are the same name as your functions. You know what? I'm just not going to. I'll call it create user command. It would work if we didn't have this and we just had create user. But PyCharm's yelling at me, so we're not going to do that. Then it's the same thing with creating an event. So the command is going to be really similar. And the values we're inserting are the name of the event, the location, and the ID of the person who's hosting it. And we need a semicolon at the end. And then we just want to execute this. So this is really similar to our create user thing, just different variables. And we're inserting into a different table. So the last function we're going to want to write is going to get our user ID. So first of all, note that this is going to be case sensitive for the name. The reason we might want this function is because, say when we're creating an event, we want to find the host ID, the ID of the person who's hosting it based on their name. This is just going to be really useful for that, so provided someone's name, which is stored in the table, we want to get back their ID. So what we're going to do is get user ID command equals f. And remember, I'm doing single quotes this time because it's small enough to fit on a single line. So same thing with the f string. What we're doing here is we want to select the ID field. That means what we want returned from the table is the ID field from the students table, where the name of the student is whatever name we're providing. So we're going to get a row, or rows technically, from the students table where we have a particular name that's equal to this name, and from that row or rows we want to select the ID. We could provide multiple things here. We could say ID and name and county, but right now we just want the ID. So we're going to execute this get user ID command thing. And once it executes, the cursor object that we created is going to store all of the row data inside of it, and to actually get a Python-friendly data structure, we just want to run the fetch all command. You may assume that there are other fetch commands. You are correct, but we're just using this for now because we want all of the rows. And then we're just going to say what if there are multiple rows. We're going to raise an index error. More than one or no user exists. Basically, if we search for a user with a particular name and two people have the same name or nobody has that name, we're just going to raise an index error because I don't want to deal with that side case, which you would actually have to figure out on your own time separately. What does it not like? Oh, there don't need to be parentheses here. But, and you may ask now, what is the data type of this user ID thing? In Python, hopefully you know what lists and tuples are. When you run the fetch all on a cursor object after running select, it's going to return a list of tuples. If you remember in Python, tuples are technically ordered while lists are unordered, meaning that a tuple, like an XY coordinate pair, the order is important, they can't be swapped, while technically a list is just, a list of objects, like a grocery list. It doesn't matter what order they're in. So it would look something like this. Say I wanted to get everything, and my two entries, FCPS counting, not, and my two entries were me, that go to FCPS, and Anna, who does not go to LCPS, but for example's sake now does. The first element is going to be the ID. The second element is going to be the name, and the third element is going to be the county. So it's just a list, unordered list of tuples. The list will be in order, but technically you can rearrange them as necessary if you need to. If you were just to ask for the ID, so if you said select ID from students, and you didn't have the where clause, so it got everything, it would instead look like this. So now if we get a user ID and we know that it's only one entry, which means that only one tuple, because the length of the user ID is the number of rows that are returned, since the length of the list is the number of tuples that are contained inside the list, and every tuple represents a row in the table. So if we know that the user ID, if the length of that list is 1 already, because if it wasn't, it would raise this index error, then we know that it's only going to be one element inside of one tuple inside of the list. So all we have to do is get the 0th element, which is this tuple, of the the 0th element of the tuple, which is this number, of the 0th tuple of the list, which is this tuple containing your single row of information that you're interested in. What that would look like is this. So this original one selects the tuple that you're interested in, and the second one gets the ID. Even though the tuple is only dimension 1, you still need to specify which element you are interested in looking at in order to get a single number, instead of a list of a single tuple of a number. If that makes sense. If that doesn't make sense, just ask, and someone will hopefully answer. And so we just want to return this. Okay, so let's create another function that gets all the users, a list of all of the users in the users table, or we call it the students table. So we're going to get users command, create a SQL statement that selects every row from our students table. And we're going to execute get users. Actually, the get users command. Hold on, I need some water. Sorry, my throat gets very dry when I lecture. And just like before, we want to use the fetch all on our cursor after we execute our select command to actually get the data we're interested in. So remember, it's going to be a list of tuples, so that means that every entry in our list is going to be a different row, each row representing a user. So users really represents a list of different users, so we can use a for each loop to go through every user in that user's list to get all of their information. And then we're just going to prettify a string that takes the 3 elements of each user, which are their ID, name, and county, and output it in a string. And all this is doing is adding a tab and then a little like thingy vertical bar in between them to make it look pretty. So now let's actually create a program that we can use. Actually, no, I don't need this. Usually you would use that if you have like multiple files and you want to make sure that when you run this one, you're actually like running it from here and not importing it as a package or something. But since we're only using this one main.py file to not confuse people who aren't as familiar with Python, I'm just not going to do that. So, let's create a few users. And remember, the syntax is name location. If you're using PyCharm, you can know because it says here. Name county, sorry. What is this not happy about? Okay. I guess it wants 2 blank lines. And as always, I'll be using my inside joke random names and counties that no one but a handful, very small handful of people will understand. So let's create 3 users in our table and get our users. And I'm just going to have a print at the end so that it prints an extra empty line. I hope this works. So let's run main. No such table students. Uh, why is it not happy? Okay. Well, time for me to debug, even though this is literally... Okay, I wrote all of this yesterday, and I checked it, and everything works, so I'm very sad that it's not working now, because this is, like, exactly what I typed, but... Oh, well, what can you do? Um... You also get to see how I debugged yesterday for, like, 3 hours. Uh, insert into students. Oh, okay, it's because I misspelled it here. Oh my god. Did no one catch that? I put students. Okay. I feel like I've done that before a lot.
I think people in the chat caught that.
Oh, Brian, why didn't you say anything? I can't see the chat. I have my notes on one screen and
Oops,
okay,
I
yeah.
thought you knew.
Yeah. I can't spell. Sorry. Thank you for yeah, thanks for catching that anyway.
Yeah. Really, you were supposed to just change all instances of student to studnet.
Oh,
Yeah, you actually spelled studnet wrong the whole lecture.
the whole wait, did I? Oh no, I didn't. You're lying. Okay. Anyways, so no more studnets.
It was a joke.
Oh.
Please laugh.
Ha 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 ha. I'm sorry, I'm very stressed right now if you couldn't tell. Um anyways, so now it created our 3 users and then it outputted the thing from the table. Now I have to rush through the rest because I did not think it would take this long. Same thing with events. Let's just create a function that gets the events. Again, it's going to be really, really similar to the last one. I have 10 minutes left. Actually, we just want the ID. And if you remember from last lecture, we're going to be joining our tables so that we can get the name of the host that's actually running it. Because remember, we have this foreign key pointing to, where is it? Here, pointing to the host ID from the students table. So the 4 elements we want to select are the event ID, name, location, and the name of the student. The syntax is very similar to last time, so let me know if you do not recognize it and need help. And I'm going to make this 3-line because it's not going to be long enough. From events, inner join, students. The students table, inner join means that we're going to take the elements that are shared in both, and we're going to join it where the host ID for a particular event is the same as the student's ID. That way, we can get the name of the student that's associated with the host ID that's stored in the table. Then we're just going to execute this. Get events command, and I will make this earlier so that you can actually see the entire thing. And then the rest of it is going to be the exact same as the get users function. Event in events, print string event 0 plus event 1 plus event 2. And remember here we're getting 4 different fields, so we need to do it 4 times. Okay, and now let us create events. So we'll create a tasty thing event that's at my house because I'm the one hosting them. And the host ID is going to be my ID, which is 1. Then we want to create an event. We'll call it Dev Club. That's on Google Meet. And the host ID for that is going to be Anna, 2. And we're going to want to get our events and print a new line. So let me run this. Yay! Okay, we now created events, and see, instead of saying the host ID, which is 1, it actually says my name. Wow, that's so cool. Okay, now let's create a rudimentary program that can actually take this information and let users interact with it. So, I really like the Python command prompt thingy, like making programs in Python command prompts, and we're going to do that. So we're just going to have a print statement that prompts the user to do something. So the first option will be creating a user, the second will be creating an event, the third will be viewing the users, the fourth will be viewing events, and the fifth will be exiting. Also, in Python, don't we just love using while true loops? Isn't this just so nice? Just kidding. You'll almost never use this, but for the purposes of teaching SQL, I'm just doing this. This is bad syntax, but because you have to use a break and continue, and that's bad. So we're then going to ask the user, what do you want to do? And if you don't know the input command, it's really easy. It just outputs this in terminal, and then whatever you type and then press enter, it sets to this prompt variable as a string. Then we're going to create a prompt int variable that stores the actual integer. So if you put in 1, 2, 3, or 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, we want to actually get that back out as an integer. So we're going to try to get the integer from the string. The int just converts it from a string to an integer. If it throws an exception, if something goes wrong, then we're going to want to tell them to only input this and continue the loop, which means reset it back at the beginning. And then this is some bougie Python stuff. If it is an integer, but it's not one of these 5, so if the value isn't contained within this tuple, which if it's one of the first 5, it will be, at least the first 5 natural numbers, then we're going to say the exact same thing. Just please input something normal. And then we're going to want to continue just like before. So this is just saying it has to be an integer, and it has to be in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If it's not, then tell them to follow directions and continue. And then the final one is if it's 5, which remember is what we're using to exit the loop, then we're just going to print goodbye and break. So if you don't know loop syntax, continue means reset the loop, break means leave the loop, which would end the program. So now let's create our things for the others. So I'm just creating the cases right now. And if it's 1, 2, 3, or 4, and it's not 1, 2, or 3, then it has to be 4. That's logic. So now we have to actually fill in these cases. So if it's the first one, then we're going to want to ask for their name. And then create a user using the name and in county they inputted. Wow, it's so helpful that we had a create user function earlier. Then we're just going to say new user with the name that we were provided has been created. And another f string with the name variable here. And we're just going to print an empty line. Okay, now we can create a user with a particular name and county. Now let's create an event. Please input the event's name. We want to get the name, location. Please input the location's name. The host. Please input the host's name. And the host's ID, remember when we create an event, we have to provide the ID of the host in the students table, not their name. So we want to use our getUserID function that we defined up here that gets a user ID from someone's name, and we're going to input the host's name, which is stored in the host variable. And we're just going to create an event that takes the name, location, and the host ID. Then we're just going to say a new event with this name has been created. Also, sorry, I know I'm going really fast. It's because we don't have any time, and I'm recording this lecture on OBS anyways. At least I think I am. I am. So I'll just post this. And if you need to watch the end again because you got confused, that's fine. And then for these three, it's really easy. If we want to view users, then we're just going to do get users. If we want to view our events, and we're just going to get events. And I'm doing print at the end of all of these so that it prints empty line afterwards. Okay, let's hope this works. Let's create a user with the name Akash, that is PWCS. Okay, so I created a new user, Akash. Well, let's view our users. Yay! Akash is now in PWCS. Okay, let's create an event. Our event will be named thing. Our location's name will be TJHSST. And the host is going to be Akash. So I'll put in Akash. So now we created our event, and let's view our events. Yay! It created this new event whose name is thing, that is at TJ, that is hosted by Akash. And then we can exit. Okay, and there is our working, functioning 100 line long that I probably could have done much shorter if I could use cases like in Java and whatever, case break thingies that nobody ever uses ever, in Python. So, I hope you guys all enjoyed. Sorry I had to rush at the end, but it's 3:45, so you are all free to go, and I just got to the end, so perfectly on time. We'll upload this to YouTube in case I was way too fast, which it probably was, but okay, thank you everyone.